Thanks for coming today. You're in for a treat. This is a great panel. It's a research paper session. The session title is called New Outlets on the New Journalism. And just in talking up here, we realized that all of us have pieces that are heading into a book that will be coming out next year called Fear and Loathing Worldwide. So you're getting an excellent preview. So we're going to go in the order of the agenda here. We're going to start with Sue Joseph. I'll just briefly introduce everybody, and then Sue will start. Sue Joseph is from the University of Technology in Sydney, Australia, and she'll be presenting her paper, Gonzo, Ethnography in Australia, Elisabeth Wynhausen's Dirt Cheap. Next, we have Christopher Kremmer, who's from the University of New South Wales in Australia, and his paper is called Gonzo with a PhD, Matthew Thompson and the Political and Literary Legacy of Hunter S. Thompson. And then we have Ashlee Nelson, who is from Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand. And her work is called A New Feminism in New Journalism, Gloria Steinem, and the 1972 U.S. presidential election. And that was the winner of the Norman H. Sims Prize for Best Student Research. So we will start with Sue Joseph.
I'm going to stand up. I've changed the name of the paper. It's now called Australia's Elisabeth, Wynhausen and a Century of Gonzo Ethnography. I've just changed it about 4 days ago. Okay, I'm aware there are several Gonzo scholars in my audience, so 3 of them sitting here. So I wish to explain this paper as a polemic. Intentionally, I have chosen a definition of Gonzo from the many out there, one that suits my argument. I think we do that from time to time, we sort of move things around. I wanted to take a look back in time and create a taxonomy, if you will, of pieces of fine literary journalism with a Gonzo sensibility throughout the past century, culminating with Australia's late Elisabeth Wynhausen. So let me begin. American writer Jacqueline does it in the East End of London, inspiring George Orwell, who reads London's work as a teen to add Paris, and some would comment Wigan Pier as well, as his own version. Latterly, Barbara Ehrenreich does it in the U.S.A, and then Elisabeth Wynhausen follows her lead in Australia, Gonzo immersion into poverty writing spanning a little more than a century. There's a direct linkage through Hunter S. Thompson's work, looking back to Orwell's process, and accordingly London, as it was London who inspired Orwell, threading its way throughout the century to influence Ehrenreich's process in the U.S.A, then flowing on to Wynhausen in Australia. All 5 authors belong to a long-standing and distinguished literary journalism tradition of deep immersion and investigation. These traditional elements are an important, if often overlooked, feature of Gonzo, I think, and as such, the authors are bound even more keenly. I argue that the 4 writers, situated either side of Thompson, engage in a form of Gonzo ethnography, ultimately critiquing issues of poverty, social divide, and a certain voicelessness of social subsets in order to bring them into mainstream consciousness, with an often self-deprecating, self-parodic, satiric, and intense, as Hunter S. Thompson said, performative lilt. Right. Despite dispute regarding the word's origin, in order to retrospectively assign meaning to the text under examination here, it's necessary to align with a specific definition, one which resonates most with me in understanding its authorial genesis. Brian Bowe argues, a preliminary summary definition of Gonzo is of an energetic and iconoclastic first-person writing style, in which the author has also adopted a performative role in the text. Further, as a style, Gonzo draws its power from a combination of social critique and self-satire. Now, this is a definition underpinning this paper. Furthermore, to uphold the linkage between the 5 texts under examination, it's important to define the ethnographic substance of the writing uniformly. Sefcovic first described Gonzo ethnography in the mid-1990s. She writes of its immersive impulse, an experimental process, both vital ingredients, along with a specific tone, voice, sensibility, and social evaluation, rejecting the notion of any privileged vantage point for observation, all demonstrated in the following text. So to begin, we'll begin a century ago, or more than a century ago, Jack London, The People of the Abyss. In his opening words, Jack London flags the ethnographic impulse of his The People of the Abyss in its preface. Quote, "I went down into the underworld of London with an attitude of mind which I may best liken to that of the explorer. With this Gonzo autoethnographic sensibility, London spent 7 weeks living with and amongst the poorest people in London at the time. He starts the text with the outraged comments of his friends when he tells them his plan. In contrast, he appears as fearless and antithetical to his peers, as Thompson often appeared to his peers 60 years later." Again, quote, "But you can't do it, you know," friends said, painfully endeavouring to adjust themselves to the psychological processes of a madman who had come to them with better credentials and brains. "What I wish to do is go down into the East End and see things for myself. I wish to know how these people are living there, and why they are living there, and what they are living for. In short, I'm going to live there myself." "You don't want to live down there," everybody said, with disapprobation writ large upon their faces. "Why, it is said there are places where a man's life isn't worth twopence." "The very places I wish to see," says London. Now, there's an argument that London was very sort of an elitist, although he did come from a deeply working class background, so there's an imbalance there, but the impulse is there. From the moment the text begins, the first person voice is evident, disparaging discussions with friends highlighting the oddity of his quest, a sardonic and contrary tone from the outset. Although he performs the role of beached American sailor with no means or money, London does pay for a safe room nearby and has access to money and friends. But his social critique and scathing questions and statements in the text are barbed and they are emphatic. This was not the first text of urban poverty, but was the first where the author lived it, drawing on experiences, discussions, observations, and rhetoric to bring to life the otherwise ignored fright of poverty. Now, next is George Orwell, Down and Out in London and Paris. The unknown Eric Blair, emulating Jack London, began his own pilgrimages into the East End of London. But, as London was a well-known, well-paid author when he descended into his abyss, the averse is true of the young Blair. At 24 years of age, he had little or no experience and was not from a working-class background. Nevertheless, Down and Out in Paris and London is an astounding examination of working-class poverty in those two cities between the two wars. Orwell's work performs an interior Gonzo autoethnography. His purpose was not to immerse himself in order to report on the underclasses. He found, put himself there, within, and then wrote. He did not know, as he wrote, that he would succeed with this text, his first published. And despite his family background, which was, sort of lower middle class, at the time he was in Paris and London eking out a living. He needed to find work in order to eat. Now, he didn't really, he imposed that on himself, and I do believe he was authentic in this because in his life he carried a great guilt about his privilege. So he was always trying to declass himself, and in a way that makes it more complex, but it doesn't really take away from what and how he wrote, I think. He writes, "It is altogether curious, your first contact with poverty." Obviously he wasn't born into poverty. "You thought it would be quite simple. It is extraordinarily complicated. You thought it would be terrible. It is merely squalid and boring. It is the peculiar lowness of poverty that you discover first. The shifts that it puts you to, the complicated meanness, the crust wiping." His tone here, while analytical, is less reporting and more interior observation. From within the space of poverty, he found himself absorbed. He then ruminates on it, his tone one of incredulity. Not so much that this is happening to him, but how its domino effect seeps into every facet of daily life, into his very body. I call this a retrospective autoethnographic Gonzo voice, looking back and analysing his predicament as a snapshot of the poverty and deprivation he saw all around him at the time. Writing Down and Out riveted Orwell's political perspective, with the Gonzo sensibility and implicit outrage at injustices beautifully rendered on the page. Orwell's first text, and the one that set him on his way as a young writer of note, is another example of what Sefcovic calls Gonzo ethnography, and I would argue is different in a temporal sense from the other 4 authors examined in this paper. Orwell was a participant observer ultimately, but at the time he was more participant than observer, more experiential than experimental. And this is where his tone is not so much self-parodic as self-deprecatory, somewhat apologetic and astounded. And the next text is Hunter S. Thompson's The Hells Angels, a strange and terrible saga of the outlaw motorcycle gangs. Thompson fell in love with the tales of Mark Twain and Jack London as a boy. This love of literature nurtured by his mother from a young age. And one of his favourite books was Orwell's Down and Out in Paris and London. Thompson went as far as writing that Orwell's text was the only kind of journalism he could pay much attention to. Thompson's body of work is large, but for the needs of this paper, it is his text, Hell's Angels, A Strange and Terrible Saga, where ethnographic parallels can be drawn with the authors of Down and Out. Brinkley writes of Orwell's immersive influences on Thompson. George Orwell's slumming with disinherited vagabonds in Down and Out in London and Paris were perhaps the supreme influences on Thompson's technique and style. That's a much bigger quote than I covered. In 1965, the Lynch Report investigated the problem of biker gangs in California. What Thompson discovered was that the writers of the report had not spoken to one biker. Every source came from the police. He then set about remedying the imbalance, an act which garnered for him the respect and then cooperation of the bikers, not only for the original article, but for the book to come. The important issue of Thompson's immersion with the bikie gang, this is a quote from him, "I've become so involved in the outlaw scene that I was no longer sure whether I was doing research on the Hells Angels or being slowly absorbed by them." And its relevance for this paper is twofold. Firstly, like the work of the four other authors discussed here, his text expresses the otherwise unheard voices of a subset of society. Thompson describes the Angels as desperate men of little or no means with no social mobility, tracing their origins to the Okies and Arkies and hillbillies who migrated to California during the Depression. Secondly, unlike most of his other Gonzo work, where Thompson himself is the centre of the narrative, in this text he set out to illuminate the bikers. His character, similar to the other four texts discussed in this paper, cast as observer-participant. Although unlike the other four texts, the bikers knew he was a journalist, gathering information about them. Thompson embedded himself for a year, a similar parameter to Orwell, Ehrenreich and Wynhausen, not London, who spent less time in London's East End. In the Hells Angels, Thompson found a subset of people qualifying it, the violence, the excessive drinking, the drug taking, the sexual proclivities, as a subset of the loser. But ultimately, in denouncing the Angels, he denounces himself. In the postscript of this text, Thompson's self-parody as a hack outlaw journalist, one who succumbs to violence just as he has been observing it, is brutal. Instead of performing the role of biker, I believe he was performing the role of cynical journalist. Indeed, here is the first time he writes of the inimitable fictional anti-hero Raoul Duke. In a nation of frightened dullards, there is a sorry shortage of outlaws, and those few who make the grade are always welcome. Frank Sinatra, Alexander King, Elisabeth Taylor, Raoul Duke, they all have that extra something, he wrote. After Thompson is beaten up by the bikies, McKean writes, his comic mask undergoes a metamorphosis from outlaw journalist, the at-large loser he just mocked a few pages ago. The ambitious and arrogant narrator becomes what he despises, a soul living in complete despair like a Hell's Angel. This work positioned Thompson as a writer of talent and substance. Next text is Barbara Ehrenreich, Nickel and Dimed on Not Getting By in America. Barbara Ehrenreich on Getting By, but not in parentheses. Barbara Ehrenreich's real performance in Nickel and Dimed on Not Getting By in America is her consistent self-parodic voice. Undercover, she leaves the comfort of her middle-class writerly existence, placing certain parameters around her emotion, and melds in as authentically as she can, narrating her experiences daily. As to her parameters, she is determined to keep within them. Firstly, searching for jobs she would not use skills derived from her profession or education. Secondly, she had to take the highest paying job and work hard to hold on to it. And thirdly, she had to take the cheapest accommodation she could find, qualified by safety and privacy. The heart of her quest is giving voice to those who are voiceless, similar to Hunter S. Thompson's Hells Angels, and the poor, similar to London and Orwell. She knows she will never truly experience poverty as those she sets out to work beside do. She writes, I was only visiting a world that others inhabit full-time, often for most of their lives. Ehrenreich travels from Florida to Maine to Minnesota, working as a waitress, hotel maid, house cleaner, nursing home aide, and Walmart salesperson. She does take the cheapest lodgings available and soon discovers that one job is not enough. At least two are needed to pay her rent. She undergoes urine tests and personality tests in order to gain any chance of a job, and soon realizes that her deception is not so great. Her specialness, simply her lack of skill at the grueling physical and mental monotony of her daily tasks. As she writes, "There's no way, for example, to pretend to be a waitress. The food either gets to the table or not. People knew me as a waitress, not because I acted like one, because that's what I was, at least for the time I was with them." Her descriptions of the work endured are graphic and are sardonic, and pointedly depict herself struggling to do what millions of underpaid men and women do every day. The text is strewn with black humour, of which she says, "It is not something you inject. The absurdity is in the world. I have to report it." As Thompson was inspired by London and Orwell to immerse himself, so too is Ehrenreich's immersion one of her most effective tools. Now, the final text I'm looking at today is Elisabeth Wynhausen, "Dirt Cheap, Life at the Wrong End of the Job Market." She's a late Australian journalist. 102 years after Jack London's Abyss was published, a little more than 70 years after Orwell's Down and Out, and just under 40 years since Thompson's Hell's Angels, in Australia, the late Elisabeth Wynhausen models her American counterpart Ehrenreich's work and produces Dirt Cheap, Life at the Wrong End of the Job Market. And she absolutely privileges Ehrenreich's work in her prologue. Wynhausen takes 9 months off from her work as a journalist for the Australian newspaper in Sydney to work in 5 service occupations at 6 separate sites. She had her own formidable social conscience, and like Ehrenreich and Thompson in Hell's Angels, she was mostly interested in giving voice to the voiceless and invisible. In her case, minimum wage earners in her affluent country. Like Ehrenreich in London, she set parameters around her sojourn into poverty, only applying for unskilled jobs, taking the first one offered, and having a room of her own with a bathroom. That's one of her parameters. Similar to London, Orwell and Ehrenreich, Wynhausen's Gonzo autoethnographic work ultimately performs as advocacy. She demonstrates a direct link between government deregulation of wage fixing procedures, individual bargaining policies, and attacks on trade unionism, to a deepened casualisation of the workforce, which is still prolific, exploitation of immigrants and older workers. She does this experimentally and experientially by immersing herself in different low-paid jobs and attempting to live on her earnings. Wynhausen's turn of phrase is pointed and barbed. At the club, she writes, "I had landed in the workplace equivalent of the land that time forgot, a strange backwards-looking social laboratory of fast-vanishing attitudes, ideas and customs. As a cleaner in the office, she was meant to be inconspicuous, but Wynhausen writes that she soon discovered how unsuited she was for the job, how she could not make herself invisible. I could no more be unobtrusive than I could ascend to a higher order of being. I spoke again. I couldn't help myself. And the balding man looked about, frowning, as if the vacuum cleaner had developed a voice." She writes mockingly of those in the well-paid workforce, creating an almost them and us binary. At the hotel, she describes the uniform. "The red vest with gilt buttons gave me a passing resemblance to a transgender bellboy." At the end of her sojourn on the minimum wage, Wynhausen admits, like Ehrenreich, that her project fails. Despairingly and self-deprecatorily, what she did discover from the final words of her text, a gut-wrenching understanding of what it is to spend your working hours unappreciated, underpaid, and unseen. The less people pay you, the less they look on your time as something you still cherish. When she wrote this, she did not know that time was something about to be cut short in her own life. Elisabeth Wynhausen died on September 5, 2013 at the age of 67. The real difference between the 4 texts under examination here and Thompson's Hell's Angels is an obvious one. He identified himself and was by no means undercover, whereas the other 4 authors performed a specific role to get as close to an experience as they could. But as mentioned above, I believe Thompson was performing the role of journalist to be accepted amongst the bikie gang. He could do something for them. All 5 texts demonstrate a Gonzo ethnographic sensibility. All 5 writers practice deep immersion into subgroups in a bid to experiment, experience and report with the social critique, self-parodic and performative sensibilities which inspires and ultimately unites them. Thank you.
Next we have Christopher Kremmer.
Thanks. Thanks everybody for coming along. Today I'd like to talk about what happens when you take a literary genre or subgenre, in this case Gonzo journalism, and use it in a very different political, social and literary circumstances from those that prevailed in its early years.
Is that all right?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah?
Okay. Very different circumstances from those that prevailed at the time of its earlier years. For example, what happens when you do Gonzo journalism in a different country from, say, the United States, in a different time, or for different purposes. Over the past year, I've been reading the work of an interesting Australian literary journalist and author, Matthew Thompson, who has been called by his publishers, but also by independent critics, the Australian guru of Gonzo. Now, I'm aware that the concept of Australian Gonzo, and the very idea that it should need a guru leading it, could cause concern. You may feel that Australians are already quite Gonzo enough, and that the emergence of a guru who might lead them forward might only exacerbate the problem. Nobody wants a literary Crocodile Dundee walking into a New York salon, holding up a weighty book and shouting, "You call that Gonzo?" No, mate, this is Gonzo. But seriously, by comparing Matthew Thompson's work with that of the genre's progenitor, S Thompson, it's possible, maybe, to discern not just similarities and differences between those two of them, but also to get a sense of Gonzo's evolution and continuing influence in contemporary writing and journalism, including literary journalism. And by avoiding solipsistic approaches in which studies of Gonzo sometimes tend to be studies of Hunter Thompson and his methods alone, we can perhaps come to a clearer understanding of how Gonzo works, or at least fresh understanding of how Gonzo works and the nature of its claims to truth, almost half a century since it first emerged. So it's getting long in the tooth, and it's still going. Like you, Sue, I'm going to rely on Beau's succinct formulation, but it's slightly different wording. I may have kind of edited this, but defines Gonzo journalism as an energetic first-person participatory writing style in which the author is a protagonist, one that, and then Dr. Ellipsis, draws its power from a combination of social critique and self-satire. But though I think that definition is adequate, it lacks, for me, a sense of Gonzo's manic extremes, and so I think it could be usefully supplemented by Hurst's description of Hunter S. Thompson's style as, quote, a crazed mix of sharp insight, humour, drugs, sex, and violence. I'm not sure about the sex. Is there much sex in I don't recall reading any memorable passages of sex in Gonzo Thompson, but there may be.
I think the Hells Angels.
Oh, the Hells Angels, of course. Yes.
Better than sex, which sort of makes it seem like, no, it's like,
Yeah.
you need sex when you have
No, you're
sex.
right. Yeah, no, I knew I must have read it somewhere. Okay, so in terms of the reference points, I think I don't want to spread too widely. For Matthew Thompson today, my remarks are largely informed by close reading of his first two books. I mean, I've read virtually everything he's written, but for today, it's just a close reading of his first two books of literary journalism, published respectively in 2009 and 2013, My Colombian Death, A Journey into the Heart of South America's Most Dangerous Country, and Running with the Blood God, Down and Dirty with Freedom Fighters, Rebels, and Misfits. And also various articles published in the Sydney Review of Books, including Boxing with Women and Don't Go to Jolo, which is a series of reportages from insurgency-affected areas of the Philippines, and his manifesto for the practice of journalism, directed really to younger journalists, called Mondo Journo, which we might get time to talk about. Unfortunately, really though, there isn't a lot of time to go into a lot of these aspects. But it is foreseen, as Sue's mentioned, that a fuller exploration of these texts and subjects will be possible in a forthcoming book that Rob Alexander and Christine, how do you say it? Isinger? Yeah, we'll be working on it as we speak, doing a wonderful job editing and getting it ready to go. As for Hunter S. Thompson, my comments are mainly going to focus on today on Fear of Loathing in Las Vegas, a savage journey to the heart of the American dream. Now, as many of you know, in the 1970s and 1980s, no self-respecting journalism student with an ounce of literary ambition in the English-speaking world, and indeed in some cases beyond, would not have had all three of the works that I'm looking at with Hunter S. Thompson today, basically the Hells Angels, the Kentucky Derby, and Fear and Loathing. I had them because I somehow intuited that they were important in a literary sense, that they contain drug references, that they contain drug references, that they contain drug references. Yeah, that's right. I see. I'm still being affected by that period. And they were entertaining, and they were directly relevant to my social life at the time. See, drug references, aspects of which came back to me, I should say, when I came past the King's, one of the cafes here on the way to the university last night, and noticed that there was a sign referring to a marijuana-friendly cafe.
Yeah, and it's marijuana and vapor. I read it.
Well,
I nearly went up there.
I'm not entirely sure what it is, but I do plan to rectify that situation at the next available opportunity. All I know is that, well, I'm not consciously aware that those three books by Hunter Thompson have had a particular influence on my literary style. I don't think so. But, you know, I wouldn't know, would I? At one level. I mean, if Gonzo, as I would contend, has gone so deeply into the zeitgeist, then I guess influence of that kind is probably at its most profound when you're not even conscious of it. It's there at some level. The fact is that 40 years later, the influence of those books in the published work of Matthew Thompson, the Australian writer I'm looking at, is readily apparent. And that's before you even open the books. Those lengthy hyperbolic subtitles alone announce that Gonzo is a generative, if barely acknowledged, force in Matthew Thompson's work, and at least when I interviewed him for this project at his rural retreat in Dungog, New South Wales in January last year. As Hurst has observed, Hunter S. Thompson had many admirers and even more imitators. And there are an unusually large number of personal and professional similarities between Hunter Thompson and Matthew Thompson, or possibly the other way around. They share a country of origin. Matthew was born in the United States to an American father who immigrated to Australia when he was still a young, Matthew was still a young child. A surname, an honorific, a hairline, personal awkwardness, and a talent for staged events as extensions of literary practice beyond the text. A real university, the University of Newcastle in New South Wales, awarded Matthew's doctorate, as opposed to Hunter's, which arrived by mail order. Both spent time in Latin America, reporting on what McKean calls points of peril, and participating in the stories that they report. Both mocked and at times challenged authority, using splenetic language to delegitimise political opponents, with a vehemence that only now, under Trump, has been matched in the greater general public discourse. So you're talking, certainly in Hunter's time, ahead of his time in so many different respects. Very interesting. Both also have written books in which drug experiences feature prominently. Both use their books as platforms for strong critiques of mainstream media and journalism practice. Both adopt outsider positions. Hunter S. Thompson is a paid-up member of the counterculture. Matthew Thompson by travelling to distant, depending upon where you live, and dangerous parts of the world, including Colombia, Iran, and insurgency-affected parts of the Philippines. And in Matthew's case, returning to his home and family in the, wait for it, Hunter Valley, north of Sydney, New South Wales. Now that's a motherload of similarities, perhaps some of them superficial. And yet the influence that Matthew Thompson most overtly acknowledges is not Hunter S. Thompson at all. It's William Vollmann. Vollmann was the subject of Matthew's doctoral research, examined by Robert Wellington and published in Literary Journalism Studies. Thompson has described Vollmann's 1990s reportage from Bosnia for Spin magazine as hugely inspiring. My argument, therefore, is not that Matthew Thompson is an imitator or an avatar of Hunter Thompson, but instead that a rather close reading of his work exposes many inflections of Hunter Thompson's techniques and methods in the work of the younger writer. And even more revealing, perhaps, are the different uses that the young pretender finds for Gonzo. I'm not sure that pretender is the right word there, given that he is rather kind of discreet about acknowledging whatever debt there may be to Thompson. The Australian author's main selling point to date has been his quest for life-affirming danger, framed as a corrective to the relatively stultifying prosperity and security of contemporary Australia. In My Colombian Death, he literally leaves his wife soon after the birth of their first children, not forever, just for the trip, to go to Colombia and take risks in order to revalidate and revalue his existence. Although, as a critical blogger has pointed out, the book fails to disclose that writing a book about going to Colombia to revalue one's life was also a motive for going to Colombia to revalue one's life, if that's not too meta. In the book, Colombia, or as Matthew refers to it, Locumbia, is a land of perpetual civil war, the highest kidnapping rate on the planet, murders uncounted, narco-terrorism, narco-militias, narco-economies, native shamans, dispensing the world's most powerful hallucinogens. The Gonzo premium on hyperbole is clearly evident. From the moment he sights it from the air, the Colombian countryside seethes with threat. Sliced by rivers and scratched by roads, and villages where farmers, labourers and families spend nights on guard against bands of guerrillas and outlaws that must roam in their thousands amid the unlimited green of forest and jungle radiating in all directions. In Colombia, the risk of murder and kidnapping and the powerful drugs leaving exhilarated, able to both cherish every moment of life. However, despite this taste for danger, Matthew Thompson avoids conflict zones such as Mosul, Syria and Afghanistan, where in the latter case, I can attest from personal experience, there's no better place to go to revalue one's own life than downtown Kabul, when the government has fled and the sectarian militias are fighting for control of the city, literally house by house, amid gunfire and loud explosions. No better place to revalue one's life than a war zone of that kind. It's not that Matthew wouldn't presumably like to go where the action is meanest, as for example his inspiration William Vollmann does or did. It's more for financial reasons, he says, having quit his job in what he perceived, to use Todd's language yesterday, as the squeamish legacy, or queasy, it was one of the other legacy media, but the queasy and squeamish legacy media. In order to go freelance, he lacks the financial resources required to cover major wars these days. And this reminds me actually of your observation yesterday, Sue, about the particular problem in Australia, a big country, small market, that really does afflict Australian writers, particularly when there are far larger countries pumping out quite good publications in your language. I was feeling kind of jealous of Elise and her Portuguese yesterday. You know, it'd be nice to have a voice spread language. Never mind. Anyway, Matthew Thompson's decision to visit Colombia and other nations in difficulty as a kind of therapy has earned him a certain amount of hostility. As one reader has put it, he is selfishly exploiting this country's pain and misery for his own satisfaction because he is bored of having a well-paying and secure job. This man's attitude is blatantly disrespectful of the people of Colombia and his own family. So exploiting the pain of others is an issue, but then again, others have still loved his book, although I don't believe that it has been published in translation as yet. But this decision to go to places where the threat level is intermittent and dispersed creates a kind of danger deficit in Matthew's first two books. Lengthy passages of anxious anticipation preface relatively modest instances of actual and present threat. These books routinely oversell what they can deliver. And he does come up with fairly innovative solutions to these problems, which I'll discuss in the next section. Of course, we have to talk about drugs, right? That's right. Yeah, right. We've got to talk about drugs. A focus on illicit drugs and other inebriants is mentioned by literary critics and theorists like Hirst as a defining characteristic of Gonzo. Hunter Thompson was not the first to write about drugs, we all know that. Boom credits Thomas de Quincey's 1821 Confessions of an English Opium Eater with having invented the discourse of recreational drug use. Thompson himself, that's Hunter, acknowledged his debt to Nelson Algren's Walk on the Wild Side and Man with the Golden Arm. Yet such is the long shadow cast by Hunter S. Thompson's own Promethean appetite for various substances. That Gonzo has, in a sense, in our own time, staked a claim to literary eternity on that particular trope. Drugs and society's tendency to problematise them occupy a special place in Gonzo writing. I think that's undoubted. And I don't know what Orwell was taking this soon, but it might be worth looking into. And they do generate a certain narrative momentum. The search for the illegal high creates suspense, enduing stories with a sense of urgency and uncertainty, not unlike that experienced by addicts seeking to score. And the illegality of the enterprise adds an edge of actual danger that cracking open an ice-cold beer cannot quite match. Hunter S. Thompson himself self-satirises his own hoarding of enormous quantities and range of inebriants, especially prior to travelling. And the more illegal drugs he carries, the more he takes, and the greater his Regis fears that their countercultural hero might get caught, or worse, go to jail, robbing them of their clown. For the reader, as well as the narrator, the fear of overdose is acute, as when Ralph Duke's attorney gives him adrenochrome, I'm not sure if that's the correct pronunciation, sourced from a living human body in their hotel room in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. And I think there's one of my few slides, I've got like about 3 slides, is a, oh, there they are, the 2. Yes. Yes, yes. Not an avatar, but certainly a lot in common. Once the endocrine gets going, this is Hunter S. Thompson's classic drug experience writing. Okay, well I'm on speed now. Good. Okay, and for comparison's sake, Matthew Thompson. Quite similar, really. The drugs are the only difference, it seems to me. In the latter case, it's YAG. It's spelled Y-A-G-E. I can't remember the pronunciation of it. Anyway, yeah, it's a psychotropic that is available in Central and South America. So here lies the solution to Matthew Thompson's danger deficit problem. He, in a sense, transfers all the danger which was supposed to come from visiting paramilitaries in Colombia and just takes some drugs and has a terrible experience. Within drug literatures, as Krauss observes, rules are inverted, authority mocked, and nonconformists become centre stage. The world's perceived and reconstructed by them. For Hunter Thompson, drug use was more than a purely recreational pursuit. It was an active ingredient in the political challenge to the existing social order mounted by counterculture of the 1960s. Turn people on, challenge the way they see reality, change reality for the better. It was a challenge which he came to believe failed, and that failure is the theme of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. But the climax of the novel is not, for me, it's the hysteria around the drugs, it's that brief Tolstoyan passage in which he turns and directly addresses the reader to inform them what the book is really about in this amazing paragraph. knew I had to deliver this paper on the way here because flying here via Sydney and Los Angeles, we flew directly over Las Vegas and Denver. For Matthew Thompson, a cathartic drug experience achieved by consuming U.S.A. provides a dramatic climax followed by a denouement in which the survivor celebrates the life he thought he had lost by risking. It's a valid representation of a state that, let's face it, many people experience. Yet it seems narcissistic, and unlike Oscar Martinez, A History of Violence, for example, it doesn't tell us much about South America. And you could add, it's entirely subjective and quite opaque. Apart from the author's word for it, there is no means provided for verifying that what is claimed that that drug experience is exactly what happened and is not being dramatised for narrative purpose. Part of Matthew's problem, or at least a distinction between what he's trying to do and what Thompson was trying to do, is the Australian dream. And remember, Hunter Thompson was searching for the American dream. The Australian dream is a rather narrow concept that upholds the importance of home ownership. We've got vision. Yet strangely, for all its flaws, My Colombian Death almost inadvertently does capture the essence of one very Australian characteristic, the perceived importance of testing oneself as an Australian in the wider world. A quest that unfortunately too often turns the world into a stage upon which confused Antipodeans come to understand themselves better by interacting on their terms largely with the other. Reading Matthew Thompson's work left me with a curious sense that it is possible to appreciate a writer's talent without enjoying their books. Thompson himself is quite aware of the limitations of his perspective and quite often self-satirises. Just one more reason why I say he's being influenced by Gonzo. But the loudness and prominence of his narrative voice in the two books under consideration here would appear to turn ethnography on its head. Instead of the researcher attempting to understand the world of his subjects from their points of view, he mobilises the locals, he mobilises them basically in his cause. In his cause, which is all about him and which, he understands their money insofar as they serve his cause. The main common ground he finds with the centres, the other is in getting trashed. And in his self-authored manifesto for contemporary journalism practice, Thompson recommends that aspiring journalists, quote, join your subjects in their intoxicants. Not bad advice. In his best work, mostly found in his contributions to the literary journal Heat and the Sydney Review of Books, the Gonzo element is not so prominent, as in the books, where the performance crowds out the journalism. When I asked myself whether Gonzo was actually helping the author or the reader in the case of his two books, the answer was unfortunately probably not. Compared to Hunter Thompson's fictional quest to reveal the meaning of a moment in history, Matthew Thompson's literary journalistic journey does seem lonely and narcissistic by comparison. It seems to lack a politics, which is strange given the terrain of the countries in which it takes place. These were not problems for Hunter S. Thompson. But as Matthew Thompson himself has said, I am not a political person. Good art reflects its times, and Thompson's struggle with the developed world on we will be a familiar one to many hanging from the end of that bungee cable. Thank you.
Ashlee Wilson, in New Feminism and New Journalism.
That's your paper.
All right. Unlike my colleagues who are in the book with me, I'm not going to be talking about Gonzo and Thompson today. But a new journalist who gets written about far less, Gloria Steinem. As new journalism developed through the 1960s and early 1970s, 1972 marked a peak in both the critical attention paid to it and in the cultural significance of the reportage of the new journalists. The 1972 U.S. presidential election saw a number of new journalists turn their use of the mode's rejection of the so-called objectivity of mainstream media to more subjective analysis of the political situation. The New Journalist's strong focus on personal perspective in the campaign journalism of 1972 allowed for a number of secondary agendas that shaped their coverage of the campaign. The key new journalists covering the campaign included Norman Mailer, Timothy Krause, Hunter S. Thompson, and Gloria Steinem. It is in Steinem's reportage that the secondary agenda is not only the most clear, but also most strongly reflects the particular role of social change as a part of what led to the new journalism peak in 1972. Steinem is perhaps best known for her role in the development and surge of the feminist movement in the early 1970s. Among other things, in 1971, she helped form the National Women's Political Caucus in order to have an impact on the 1972 campaigns, and she was elected spokeswoman for the caucus at the 1972 Democratic Convention. As Amanda Izzo says, quote, "Many people might identify Steinem and feminism as one and the same," end quote. And though, of course, reality is much more complex, and Steinem was neither the first nor the only advocate of the feminist movement, she has become the definitive feminist in the eyes of much of the media. Steinem herself has said, "I don't think there is such a thing as a feminist icon. I guess it just means that you're recognizable, which for me was just an accident. If I was a physicist or astronaut or mechanic, I would be just as much a feminist." This suggests that to Steinem, being a feminist is a part of who she is, rather than her career. Yet it is the overpowering image of Steinem as the figurehead of feminism, and the notion that she is synonymous with feminism, which has led many to not look past her role as an advocate of feminism to the critical importance of her role as a journalist, and as an advocate and practitioner of new journalism. The deficit of scholarly work done on Steinem's role as a new journalist is reflected in the lack of critical discourse on her campaign journalism. If Thompson's Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail 72 is one of the most well-known new journalism texts to cover the 1972 election, Steinem's reportage is probably the least discussed. Both Steinem's role as a new journalist and her coverage of the 1972 campaign are underrepresented and largely forgotten in modern critical analysis of new journalism. In some ways, the neglect in critical analysis of Steinem's role as a new journalist may be due to an overshadowing by her more famous role as a feminist. However, to confine analysis of her only to her role as a feminist, and to not acknowledge her significance as a journalist in both the development of new journalism and the advancement of feminism in journalism, has overtones of the patriarchal discrimination in mainstream journalism that Steinem faced in the 1960s and 1970s. In actuality, Steinem was not only one of the key new journalist writers in 1972, but she also played a large role in the foundation of the mode. She was a vocal advocate, believing new journalism to be capable of being more truthful and representative than mainstream journalism, which was locked into the pursuit of objectivity. Steinem co-founded Ms. in 1972, and both she and the magazine were key contributors to the 1970s feminist movement. Just as the early 1970s was a time ripe for the peak in new journalism, it was a time for changes in the roles women were allowed to have in journalism. Much like new journalism was in part born from a belief that there was a void of personal and literary reportage, Ms. was founded to fill a gap in feminist discourse in journalism. Steinem was the first woman speaker at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. in 1972, not long after women journalists were first allowed to join. Describing the experience, Steinem remarked, "They gave me a necktie," and stated that she believed that to the male journalists in the club in 1972, she was an oddity. That Steinem was the first woman speaker in 1972 demonstrates the era of change taking place in journalism in the early 1970s that we see at an apex in 1972. marked by the prominence of new journalism and the broadening scope of what was acceptable in mainstream journalism. That the first woman speaker at the National Press Club was Steinem illustrates the consequential role that her journalism had in that period of change. That she was an oddity and given a traditionally male accessory to wear is indicative of a level of uncertainty and tension that the increasing role of women in journalism produced in some areas of the field, just as new journalism had been doing since its rise. And yet, despite the significance of her role as a journalist, analysis of Steinem as a new journalist is rare, as are even mentions of her in typically male-dominated lists of new journalists at the time in critical texts on the mode. The overall lack of critical analysis of Steinem's new journalism is indicative of the general context of critical analysis that focused on Steinem only as a feminist and not also as a new journalist. In actuality, Steinem's role as a new journalist and her role as a feminist represent the natural intersection of social change and the new journalist mode that came together so strongly in 1972. New journalism was what gave Steinem the opportunity to write about politics from a feminist perspective. In Steinem's experience, in the 1960s, women journalists were not allowed to cover campaigns, or were not assigned to cover campaigns. Quote, "If I tried for an assignment covering a major political leader, I would be asked to write about his wife instead. The world of politics allowed few women into it, even as journalists." End quote. Now, this is not to suggest that Steinem's dual roles as a new journalist and a feminist indicate that new journalism was a haven of feminism. For instance, Steinem recalls covering a Bobby Kennedy campaign event with Gay Talese and Saul Bellow, during which Talese leaned across me, as if I was neither talking nor present, and said to Bellow, "You know how every year there's a pretty girl who comes to New York and pretends to be a writer? Well, Gloria is this year's pretty girl."
Talese is really go tanky, isn't he?
But there does seem to have been a correlation between the changes happening in journalism and society that opened up possibilities for new journalism, and those which allowed for an increasing feminist perspective. Furthermore, new journalism, as a mode born in part from a desire for the use of subjectivity in journalism to contribute to social change, was a fitting avenue for the advocacy of women's issues and the feminist movement. The natural melding of advocacy for social change and use of the new journalism method are demonstrated in their intersection in Steinem's coverage of the 1972 campaign. Steinem's primary work of campaign journalism that year was the article "Coming of Age with McGovern, Notes from a Political Diary," which was first published in the October 1972 issue of Ms., with this great cover of George McGovern. Coming of Age with McGovern was later included in Steinem's 1983 anthology of journalism, Outrageous Acts and Everyday Rebellions, as part of the chapter Campaigning. Steinem's personal perspective is key to Coming of Age with McGovern, and to the way that the article illustrates her synchronous development as both a campaign journalist and a feminist. Instead of focusing on the narrative timeline of the 1972 campaign, as does much of the other coverage of it, Steinem chronicles both her personal and her professional relationship with McGovern as a parallel to his political career, from their first meeting in July 1965 to August 1972, just after the Eagleton scandal had been revealed, in which the press learned of the history of the depression and shock treatment of McGovern's vice presidential candidate, Thomas Eagleton. Steinem's political diary approach is key to both her emotional honesty about her development as a feminist and journalist, and to the humanizing approach she takes to McGovern as a candidate. Her focus in her 1972 campaign journalism was on McGovern, and not on Nixon, because of the personal nature of her reportage. She was not covering the campaign as a whole, and instead covered it from the perspective of a person with a relationship with McGovern who had campaigned for him, and who had changed as a feminist and seen changes in feminism in politics through her history campaigning for him. The title, Coming of Age with McGovern, points both to Steinem's coming of age as a campaign journalist and feminist, and to McGovern's coming of age as a political candidate with his own education in women's political issues. Her experiences covering McGovern's campaigns in both 1968 and 1972 not only illuminate the development of the senator as a political candidate, but directly influence Steinem's own political awareness as both a journalist and feminist. In 1968, Steinem did not just cover McGovern's campaign as a journalist, she actually worked on it. Quote, "Because there are so few people in this campaign, we all end up doing everything. So far, I have been a pamphlet writer, advance person, fundraiser, lobbyist of delegates, errand runner, and press secretary, consecutively or simultaneously. I'm telling myself it's educational," end quote. Her journalism, therefore, offers the most intimately personal perspective of the campaign possible. It is not just about the campaign, it is also a part of the campaign. Steinem's role as a journalist and her role as a campaign worker here are fused. Her comment that she was telling myself it's educational points to her simultaneous development of both her experience with politics and her career as a journalist. The dual role of campaign worker and campaign journalist represents the function of the new journalism mode's more flexible stance on subjectivity in reportage. Her close relationship with McGovern represents the most clearly personally influenced reporting of the new journalists who covered the 1972 campaign. And yet Steinem herself never really suggests that her relationship with McGovern and her obvious bias for his campaign is problematic for her journalist perspective until the end of the original article. In a passage that does not appear in the Outrageous Acts and Everyday Rebellions collection, Steinem considers the professional practicalities of the dual nature of their relationship. Quote, "I walk down the hall trying to square the two experiences. He's a presidential candidate, all distance and staff insulation and power, but he is also a familiar and honest friend," end quote. It is in this analysis of her friendship with McGovern and what that meant for her work as both a feminist and a journalist that Steinem's own awareness of the effect of her bias is most clearly drawn. She both feels guilty about not using her access to McGovern to more clearly impress upon him the importance of women's issues, and aware that she can never report on him with the same removal as other journalists, stating, in the Eagleton case, for instance, "I couldn't think of McGovern's withdrawn a resolution as either a political manipulation, let him take his case to the country, or some cowardly sign. Only that he had once had to deal with psychiatrists and hospitals on behalf of a relative, and that fact must make it much tougher for him to decide." Even in this reflective analysis, Steinem's problem with her subjectivity does not lie with its impact on her journalism. The statement about the Eagleton case is a matter-of-fact observation that her perspective is obviously going to be different from a reporter who did not personally know McGovern. The guilt she feels is as a feminist, quote, "about not using what access I had to bridge that insulation," end quote, to help make McGovern more understanding of women's issues and their importance to his campaign. Though her reporting from within the campaign is in some ways illustrative of the new journalism immersive reporting method, the dual campaign worker and journalist role is not an intentional approach, but a natural byproduct of Steinem's binary as both a politically active feminist and a journalist. Both this dual role and the particular quality of McGovern as a candidate afforded Steinem unique opportunities as a woman reporter in 1968. For example, she describes attending a luncheon with McGovern at the Time magazine boardroom, during which the appearance of women at these events is not a part of the ritual. And I doubled the error by bringing along another woman, a public relations expert who is also a McGovern volunteer. Steinem's experience at this encounter highlights the disparity between the treatment of men and women in journalism in 1968. The result was some embarrassment, especially at times, and endless lady jokes, much hesitancy over whether to serve ale and cigars, and editors who excused themselves if they said damn. The other woman didn't mind being tough into such situations by her experience in business. But I was surprised by the editor's condescension and by the low intellectual quality of their questions. Are these the journalistic heights to which we've all been climbing? The treatment of Steinem as an oddity at this lunch, to which she was not meant to be allowed, points to the inequality still present in journalism, despite the progress that afforded her the opportunity to be there. The question, are these the journalistic heights to which we've all been climbing, suggests an early sense of the need for change in the approach of journalism as a field, not just as a form. The attitude of the male journalists also contrasts sharply to the respect with which McGovern spoke to Steinem from their very first meeting in 1965, as highlighted in the beginning of the article, when McGovern converses with Steinem in a way that, quote, assumes I am an equal, end quote. Because Steinem's article encompasses a lengthy period of time in snapshots from her experiences with McGovern, it is able to clearly and immediately draw connections in the evolution of her support of his candidacy and her advocacy as a feminist. Her depiction of McGovern at his 1971 meeting connects her continued support of him as a candidate with the sense that he is more open to the increasing strength of the feminist movement than many other politicians. He is measurably better than the other candidates on issues of interest to women, and he won't lead the humanist revolution, but then no individual could. Those marked by race or sex for society's subordinate roles will have to do that. But he may be one of the few leaders who will let fundamental change happen. According to this analysis, it was not that McGovern was necessarily the ideal of diverse leadership, but that of the options available in the political climate of 1972, he was one of the few who would let fundamental change happen, so that a more diverse future may be possible. Thus, though McGovern may not be perfect, Steinem's claim that he is the best feasible candidate in 1972. I ended by praising McGovern as the best white male candidate. The ways that McGovern failed to live up to Steinem's ideals are representative of the broader political climate of the United States in 1972 that McGovern conformed to in order to attempt to win the election. The joint evolution of Steinem's feminist beliefs and her role as a journalist played out in the Coming of Age with McGovern article alongside the development of McGovern as a candidate, and the coming of age of the title bore out in multiple aspects of both Steinem and McGovern. Steinem's use of the deeply personal aspects of the new journalism mode in her campaign journalism portrays not just a perspective of her campaign, but also of the increasingly strong feminist movement. Her reportage speaks to the idea that the enduring works of campaign journalism from 1972 are those which were not just about the campaign, but which did something more, that participated in and contributed to the tumult of social change at that time. Her campaign coverage offers a unique viewpoint of the intersection of the role of feminism and journalism during the 1972 campaign, and what the potential outcomes of the election meant for feminism. Her personal perspective in Coming of Age with McGovern of her own evolution as a feminist connects potentially abstract notions of socio-political change to a revealing personal narrative. She was able to include in her campaign reportage for Ms. the kind of reporting from a feminist perspective that does not seem to have been present in most other media. In her preface to Outrageous Acts and Everyday Rebellions, Steinem writes, "The activist in me doesn't feel at all happy to find that this or any of its sister books is still relevant. I would feel far more rewarded if this collection were so out of date with most readers that it ranked with Why Roosevelt Can't Win a Second Term. This comment is indicative of the context of Steinem's campaign journalism outside of just being about the 1972 campaign, that it was also a part of the feminist movement at the time. It is this second context that gives her journalism a continued relevance past 1972. We may not care that Roosevelt can't win a second term, but arguments about the detrimental effect of a Nixon presidency on the feminist movement and the need for more progressive and diverse candidates continue to be a powerful part of the living history of the feminist movement as it builds on the recent past rather than forgetting it. In Steinem's campaign journalism, there is a sense of a contemporary effect to the combined efforts of feminists that her reportage was a part of. Over the course of her personal experiences with McGovern's campaign from 1965 to 1972 in Coming of Age with McGovern, she portrays a sense of shifting socio-political climate and comes to a kind of call to arms for the burgeoning feminist movement. Of course, we won't let up our vigilance for a moment. Women are never again going to be mechanics, whether it's mindless coffee making or mindless policy making. It is this call to arms, this effort to contribute to societal change, alongside the personal and the political, that is the something more factor to Steinem's campaign journalism in 1972.
I'd like to open up the floor to questions.
Let me ask all three of you a question about politics. Certainly Hunter Thompson was a political junkie. And I don't know about Matthew Thompson, but perhaps he was as well.
Point of difference, actually, but continue.
With Gloria Steinem, I think she started off as a journalist and became a politician, increasingly so after 1972. I think she wrote very little literary journalism after that time. I may be incorrect about that. But Hunter Thompson continued to write some form of literary journalism later on. So maybe all three of you could address that, but was there something about the women's movement or politics for women that caused Gloria Steinem to have to make a choice between the two? And why were the male authors able to continue to do both?
I wouldn't agree that she did make a choice. She definitely, I mean, she was still involved with Ms. after 1972. She still edited it. She still wrote for it. She's got later pieces in like her Outrageous Acts and Everyday Rebellions collection. I mean, obviously she, I don't know if we want to define the start and end date of new journalism in this panel, but I mean, obviously she's not doing new journalism after a certain point, but she was definitely still writing. I mean, she's increasingly lecturing on feminism and being involved in that side of politics, but it doesn't stop her from writing.
No, I don't mean writing, I mean writing literary journalism.
Well, I guess I still would say that I think that some of her later essays would qualify as literary journalism, some of her later articles in Ms. anyways.
Fair enough.
In terms of Matthew Thompson, I mean, and this is one of the few areas where really Matthew Thompson is completely different in a way to Hunter Thompson, and I think it's actually, it seems to me, it's a matter of opinion. It's a weakness that he doesn't he doesn't have. He's not comfortable with politics really. He's in that sense he's quite a natural journalist at one level, a typical. And he's also very typical of his generation. He postdates the kind of era of Thompson's era, but even mine, whereby politics was sort of something like bread and butter, you know, like politics, you had it in the home. Matthew's family came from the States, so they were kind of emigres to Australia, and maybe that played a role. You know, he felt, he talks about growing up in an accented family, and there really weren't very many Americans living in Australia in those days. But it does seem to, I mean, when you see the great energy that Hunter Thompson drew from politics and gave to it as well, it just seems to me, I ended up feeling that, well, Matthew is a representative of his generation. They're very cynical about formal party politics. He does have political interests and convictions, but he does not see them at all through the paradigm of party politics, and that's a real difference for him. He'd rather organise an event, that kind of made people think about why women can't. It's illegal for women to box in New South Wales or something like that. That's the sort of issue. Yeah, it still is. Yeah, and so he'll break the law to kind of organise an event where there's a punch-up between women. Yeah.
And the authors that I looked at, I mean, the four authors, or the two authors either side of Thompson, I believe, demonstrate and were performing an advocacy form of journalism. And I believe, I say that Hunter Thompson, I don't say his Hells Angels is advocacy as such, but he's definitely giving voice to the voiceless with the subset of the Hells Angels Vikings. So in terms of politics, that writing was political writing about poverty, before that I looked at. Does that answer?
How do you see that I haven't read Elisabeth Wynhausen, but if in her case it's also this Gonzo personal approach, a bit like Gloria Steinem, including the view that it's different from the others as a woman.
Her work's different from
From the three others.
But she modelled her work on Barbara Ehrenreich. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Ehrenreich. I've heard it so many different ways. Ehrenreich. So she models her work on that, and she says that she tips her hat to that. She tipped her hat to that. But she saw it as deeply political and necessary, and it was the wave of casualisation and immigrant exploitation is what she was looking, or what she discovered, but I think she knew she was going to find that anyway, with the work that she did in Australia.
Chris, I have a question for you about Matthew Thompson. So I had never read him. I thought it was really interesting. He considers himself a journalist, though, right?
Oh yeah,
Okay,
absolutely.
so
Yeah. In fact, this is his manifesto. I'll scroll it just as we keep going. He's got this whole manifesto. Do not go to journalism school. Hey guys, we have a problem.
Well, the reason I asked is because when you asked him if he sees any similarities to what he does and what Hunter Thompson did, he said, he considers himself more like William Bolton, who, is more a fiction writer, I think, than anything else. So I just don't get it.
No. Well, he's very idiosyncratic. He wrote an obituary of Hunter S. Thompson when Thompson died, and it was, it wasn't gushing. But we did acknowledge Hunter Thompson's, contributions and talents. But he's scathing about what he called late Thompson. He aligns himself, if anything, with Thompson with Hell's Angels. Which a decision I would admire and feel aligned to, and yet what he's doing in practice is not. I really strongly feel it should be. I don't know if it's right to have such a strong feeling about what he should be doing, but I just think that he's got a lot of talent. He's a very good writer, and I'm finding it hard to see where the Gonzo is actually making a positive contribution for his work. It's helping his relationship with his publisher. And unfortunately, it's a trade publisher, and this is the sort of Gonzo where it's like, your greatest fans are probably your worst enemies. They want you to, the publisher likes this kind of danger man, kind of, it's all going off, it's all happening kind of journalism. Get a bit of the family story in, talk about your domestic problems because you're going and like living the life on the edge. And it's pretty kind of down market, really. And, Macmillan, so yeah, but I mean, they're all the same these days. Trade publishing level, they're very, it's the dollar, right? Yeah, so.
Did he go to journalism school?
Yes. Well, no, he studied English. He studied English actually.
He did his PhD.
That was a PhD, but no, he did history. And he won and English. And he won the English medal at University of Newcastle after being kind of the first time around. Okay. He was kicked out for being a naughty boy. This is what I mean. Do not be an activist. So that's the kind of.
Yes, amazing.
Number 4 is eliminate your sentimentalism, and the last one and the other one
Was also?
no, was it the absolute opposite?
It was.
Was it?
Yes.
It said acknowledge your sentiment.
Yeah,
Recognize.
Then you have to eliminate
They
it.
didn't say that.
Yeah, first of all, you have to recognize.
Yeah, and then you get
12 steps.
Almost like time for door.
And usually for a code of practice, he starts with preparation. There are certain things you need to do to prepare yourself to do journalism. And then when you start doing it in the field, and he's very into immersion, he likes immersion very much.
Wow.
Yeah, you know, to do that sort of detail. And here's the one about intoxicants.
Number 10.
Yeah, join your subjects and intoxicants. And then there's even a writing section. But don't go to journalism school.
I want to thank all of you for your papers. I didn't hear the first 2 because I was in another session, but I really enjoyed Ashlee's. I think it's very important work to look at Gloria Steinem.
Very interesting.
There's a big gap there. I appreciate what you're doing with that, and I'd love to read a copy of your paper. I'll send you an email and
Yeah,
ask for it.
absolutely.
That'd be great. And congrats on winning the award for Best Student
Thank
Paper,
you.
too. Yeah. I've started to look at Gloria Steinem a bit myself because I'm interested in her as one of the literary journalists who did social advocacy journalism. I mean, and there are a number actually in that time period. But you make a really good point, I think, about how the new journalism gave some writers the freedom to write literary journalistic pieces that push for social change. And that's a really good insight, I think, for that time period.
It's research that's come from the PhD that I'm about to hand in my dissertation. So a lot of that's one of the main threads of theory that's running through my PhD is the idea that they're doing something else besides just reporting on the campaign.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, but Steinem's is definitely the one that's the most tied into this idea of social change.
Yeah, it is really interesting. I can't wait to read your dissertation.
Thank you.
But it's I think you're onto something there. I think that's true in some other periods too, the ones that I think Tom Connery long ago identified, like the late 19th century, the 1930s, the Great Depression, at least in the United States, and the new journalism period, and maybe contemporary times because they're so messed up. But there does seem to be, when there's a lot of chaos, actually, I'm a journalism historian too, so journalism thrives in times of crisis, but so does literary journalism, big time. I think it was Tom who said that.
Probably.
Right? Yeah, probably long ago, but it makes a lot of sense.
There's a lot of terrifying links between 1972 and 2016.
I know.
Yeah.
I know. I'm touched and moved that a person, who's a lot younger than I am sees that because I was 18 in 1972, so it really hit home.
Yeah.
But it's heartening that you would see that too. So thank you for a really fine paper.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question.
I just want to comment about Sue. I really enjoy this approach of the sensibility, of the Gonzo sensibility, and the fact that you identify different threads maybe into the sensibilities, the experiential, the self, deprecation. And of course, and it was interesting that you were on the first panel as well, because there is a crossover in the experiential between between undercover journalism and gonzo journalism. And the undercover journalism, the experiential aspect is very coded, and it's very safe to some extent, against what was said about the dangers of going undercover. But from a reader's perspective, the experiential is very safe. We understand, is he going to be recognized, is she going to, or not. But it seems that in the two writers at the that you were commenting on at the end, where what would be closer to undercover as experiential becomes more interesting in terms of the female reporter not being able to not comment on the reversal of role that they accept. And then that's where they become almost more rebellious. It's not just undercover experiential, but that's where almost this Gonzo sensibility is more pregnant, more marked in a sense.
And they couldn't keep quiet, really.
That's right.
They
that's
sort
right.
of blew their own cover
That's
quite
right.
often.
Because I worked on a late undercover piece by Florence Aubenas, who does very much what the last two writers are, looking at the precarity of contemporary work. And it's a very boring read, actually, because she goes undercover and you can see the class. The class socialization happening, an upper class or middle class educated person playing at being, and everything was very expected until we get into the genderization. When she gets into situation where the danger is really to give up on who she is, on her agency, and there are moments when she actually speaks. And there she's more gonzo, because there she's rebellious. There she goes against something. She writes against, as opposed to the certain conformity of the experiential of undercover.
Well, the two women, Ehrenreich and Wynhausen, Wynhausen came from the Netherlands. Her family survived the Holocaust there, and they traveled as far away as they could from Europe, and ended up in Sydney, Manly in Sydney. So it was very there was nothing privileged about her upbringing in the early days until they obviously established themselves. Ehrenreich, even though she said she herself was fairly middle class, but her background, her family, her father and her grandfather were both deeply working class. So she had that impact.
Oh, I was just going to say, isn't there a bit in that book where she talks about the memory of her father going from door to door, and she went with him as a 5-year-old?
Yeah, so she's had
trying to look for work. And
then Jacqueline also came from very, he was working as a 14-year-old doing everything, giving the money to the parents and his mother. And Orwell was the only one who came from privilege, and that was almost, he had to declass himself. That was his life impulse, was to class himself. And talk about political and aesthetic, that was what he was aiming at, and that's what Thompson took from Orwell. He wanted to be political, but he also wanted to be aesthetic. He wanted it to be an art form. And somewhere in my head, that's how the whole Gonzo, Thompson's Gonzo came from. He wanted to be a standout, he wanted to be different, political but different, and an art form, something you could almost...
He wanted to have the eye of the photo, the eye of the photographer, so yeah, there's that art.
Ultimately, one of the novels.
Well,
this is great.
He wanted to make a mark.
Oh, yeah, but as many journalists do, they get to fiction through it.
But he ended up being addicted to journalism. I think the novelist's goal was earlier. I mean, not the
Oh, well, I think when he got the chance, as a lot of journalists do, when they get the chance to write that novel, that's what he did with journalism.
I don't know if I answered your question, but subverting.
Absolutely novel. It's written as a novel, it's meant to be a novel.
It's not.
Yeah,
It was
I'm
written
sure
for
it is.
Rolling Stone. It wasn't written as a novel.
Because we're going to disagree with you.
Yeah.
We won't take it back. I don't know, I might lose.
Well, let's thank our panelists. You lost.